It is a spicy Friday episode on tap, people, featuring a look at the best fantasy goalie options across the NHL, while also talking to a special guest who knows just a little bit about how to dominate your goaltending roster. Let's get it.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everybody? Happy Friday, and welcome back to your show, the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast with Steele and Flip. And we are fired up today, people. I alluded to it right off the top, and I am more fired up than usual because today we have a very special guest on tap to discuss potentially the most important subject that you can master when it comes to a good fantasy hockey squad, and that is the goaltending lineup, Steele. We have Michael Amato from goaliepost.com coming up in a few minutes. Steele and I are also going to share our thoughts about next season's fantasy goaltending market. We have lots of great questions to ask Amato. He is here to show you what you need to be doing over the next few weeks because, Steele, I can be honest, this is one of those things that you really can get screwed over with or get lucky with to make or break your year. But first, thank you for making us your first listen every single day. Steele and I really appreciate that love. But seriously, my friend, the goaltending roster on your team is always a hot topic. That's why I'm glad to have an expert on today. Not like we don't know what we're talking about, but let's just say some of us have had Carter Hart on their roster for way too long, and it's time to move on. So I'm hoping I'm going to learn a few things today. Our listeners are going to learn a few things, and we're going to have a good conversation about goalies, my friend. So take it away.
Yeah, that's always my mindset going into a fantasy league and fantasy drafts is goalies are a hot commodity at all times and to be able to draft them in the proper round at the proper time is a big thing. And like you said, it make or breaks your team. In my opinion, I think goalies are probably one of the biggest commodity and kind of player you need to have to win your fantasy league. So I'm excited to get the expert going. A guy who can, probably back us up with some of the takes that we've had over the last couple of weeks. But I'm excited to see what he, his thoughts and his opinions on some of the questions we have lined up for him. And it's going to be a great episode. So make sure you're staying tuned in, eyes locked, and, we're going to get it. We're going to get it very soon.
And listen, eyes locked is where you need to have your attention for this position. And especially when we mentioned we had a keeper dynasty special episode the other day. If you missed it, check that out. YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We are free and available across all platforms you find your favorite content. So make sure if you missed any episodes, hit that subscribe button. You won't miss any more. That's for sure. But Steele, honestly, it's one of those things, and I'm honest with when I make mistakes with my fantasy squad, and I think that's why some of our listeners appreciate coming on every day and hearing me kind of ramble off at the mouth about some of those things that I do wrong. But it happens, and the goaltending scenarios in some of your leagues, like if you're in a keeper or dynasty, it really can get tricky, especially if you have 10 or more teams. You're going down to the nitty-gritty with some of these options, and I think that's what's going to be a great part of today's episode is we are heading into the season looking at a lot of 50-50 splits, and that's going to be one of the themes that we're going to discuss with Amato coming up in a few minutes is if you can get the right guys here, you might be able to steal a goaltender at a cheaper round who ends up playing 40, 50, 60 games, who might not have only one season ago. So we're going to look at that for sure, Steele. I know that's something that you brought up off air. We're going to ask Michael Amato, and he's coming up right around the break. So please stay tuned for that and make sure you keep it locked right here because there is going to be a lot more guests coming up this summer on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast.
There is a lot to talk about. I'm super excited for this episode. I think we should get Michael Amato on as quick as possible because I'm ready to fire the questions his way so he can help everyone out there tuning in to the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast and even help maybe you and I as well with our fantasy teams, strategy-wise. Where should we pick our goalies? Who should we be looking for? I'm excited to get him on the podcast. So let's do that, Flip. Let's get him on here.
And joining us now, the aforementioned goalie fantasy guru, Mr. Michael Amato, managing editor at goaliepost.com and goaltending fantasy extraordinaire. Trust me, my friends, this is the guy you want to be listening to. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you on today, and thank you for taking the time.
Anytime. That's quite an intro. I think I can only go down from there. So,
Well, this is what I do. I tend to kind of go off at the hip, go off at the mouth, and make a lot of noise. But I think what the listeners can cut through the noise and listen to today is we can all agree fantasy hockey, goaltending can make or break you. And it really is a spot on your roster that you have to know what you're doing a little bit, I would like to think. And heading into this season, I have a lot of questions for you. But the first one that I need to get off my chest is looking across the league. It seems like there's more 50-50 splits, 1A, 1B options than I can remember. Is that de facto number one title meaning less than ever? Because I'm seeing a lot of options here where goalies, it can go either way this year in terms of the options teams have in net.
yeah, I think the number one goalie is like kind of a thing of the past, except for, a select few around the league. I think there was maybe only 5 goalies last year that actually hit 60 appearances.
Right.
So, yeah, you just don't see it too often anymore. And I think even, goalies that are quote unquote a number one, I think that definition has sort of been redefined a little bit. So like a number one now on a lot of teams might play like 50 to 55 games, which means, that backup or 1B is going to get 30 to 35 starts, which is great for fantasy because it just gives you so many more options to draft from. Maybe 15 years ago, you just didn't have that many, right? You had a few tandems and a lot of starting goalies. You had Martin Brodeur playing like 72 times. He just didn't have a lot of options to choose from if you missed out on a goalie. And I think it also kind of helps your drafting now. You don't have to rush necessarily to grab a goalie really early on if you don't want to. It just gives you more options later on to pick from.
Yeah, and to your point, you said, goalie B, he's going to play, roughly 30 to 35, 40 games, maybe even. So at that point, when you're drafting your fantasy goalies and, you're kind of looking down the line, and like you said, there's going to be a lot of goalies this year that are probably going to be splitting time. Do you choose goalies from the same team? So, if, for example, if you end up picking Matt Murray with your first goalie selection, do you go ahead and choose Ilya Samsonov because he's going to be getting those reps in as well?
Yeah, I think that's a strategy you can use. I would sort of caution to do it like I think the two you mentioned is a good example. Like the Leafs are going to be a strong team. They're probably going to like cruise to 100 points. So if you're doing it on like a high end team, like Toronto, Colorado, something like that, it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a little more challenging on maybe like a mediocre to sort of a weaker team because if it really goes bad, then you're in trouble because you don't have sort of that other option. But yeah, like sort of if you're taking Murray and you take Samsonov, if Murray happens to go down with an injury, which seems plausible, you have Samsonov right there that can just step in, right, and play a ton. So yeah, I think that definitely works depending on the tandem and I think depending on the team.
And we actually discussed that, Steele, a couple of weeks ago when we talked about backup goaltenders. We both had Ilya Samsonov on that list just because of the exact reason you mentioned, Michael, that some of these situations are pretty volatile. And the likelihood that the second, quote unquote, second guy steps in and eats a lot of minutes is looking more and more likely for some of these situations. You can't predict injuries. But given the track record of Matt Murray, and it's hilarious that we went directly to the Leafs because right at the top of my list was a question for you about this goaltending duo that seems to be a powder keg right now for the Toronto Maple Leafs, but we'll see what happens. I want to ask you about another former Toronto Maple Leaf, so very near and dear to Toronto Maple Leafs hearts or not. Is Jack Campbell's value next season as a fantasy option? I'm looking at this NHL list right here beside me, and it came out only a couple of days ago. I'm sure you've had a look at their fantasy top 25 goalies. Right there at number 6, ahead of guys like Markstrom, Demko, Ottinger, and others, is Jack Campbell. I don't know what you think about that take, number 1, and I just want to know what you think about the projection overall for Jack Campbell next season.
Yeah, I definitely don't have Campbell that high. I think he's in a good spot. I think his value is very similar to what it was last year. I think like Toronto and Edmonton are very comparable teams as far as the regular season goes, like as far as how they're going to finish in the standings. I think Campbell's a great option. What concerns me about him is, his durability. He's never played 50 games in a season. So right there, and this year he's officially a number 1, right? I know he had split time with Anderson before, and last year he was sort of supposed to split time with Mrazek, but he ended up playing a lot more because Mrazek really struggled. But now I think It's going to be him and Stuart Skinner. So he's officially the number one guy. Can Jack Campbell play 55, 60 games? I don't know. Like in Toronto, I think we saw a lot of times where he would play like 3-4 games in a row and then he needed a bit of a break, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be my one concern. And I think if you look at the Oilers as well, they're probably not a lot, but a little bit weaker than Toronto defensively. I think he's going to probably face a few more high quality scoring chances than he did with the Leafs. So again, I think he's probably a top 15, maybe top 10 goalie for sure.
Yeah.
But I'd put him in that like Darcy Kemper category, just like a solid.
That is hilarious.
A solid.
That's exactly what I said not
team.
5 minutes before you came on the show. So thank you so much. Pat on the back from me. I appreciate you. Please continue.
Yeah, there you go. I've got him on my list just outside the top 10. I think he's a fine choice, but like, I would prefer to have like a Markstrom, a guy is going to probably for sure play a lot more, even like a Demko. Even though the Canucks I don't think are as strong as the Oilers, but I think Demko is going to play a ton and he's really good. His numbers are really great on a struggling team. So yeah, it's not that anything against taking Campbell that high. It's just I think he comes with a lot more risk than some of the others.
Hey, I think we can all agree with the breakdown that you just provided. Look, that is Michael Amato, manager at goaliepost.com. He is going to stick around for at least a few more questions from Steele and I coming up around the break. I have to grill him a little bit about some of the young goaltenders that he sees out on that fantasy landscape that you might need to shelve or keep in the stash pocket for later in the season. But very quickly, we need to pay these bills, and I need to tell you about betonline.net. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs. Find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Find reviews and news of every league, including the MLB. Shout out to Amato and his Jays cap, the NFL, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, and even golf. BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, podcasts, and more, they have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening right now. BetOnline, where the game starts.
Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Don't forget, we are free and available on all podcast platforms, which also includes YouTube. And thank you so much for all the love and support out there. Flip and I appreciate all of you tuning in for today's episode with our special guest, Michael Amato. Let's get back into the conversation, though. There's a lot of questions I have for you, Michael, and I really want to take the angle from the actual fantasy draft itself right now and where you should draft your goalies. Because, over the last 4 or 5 years, I've really implemented this strategy for myself that I don't draft a goalie until the 3rd or 4th round. So for the first 2 rounds, I'm always drafting my first forward, first defenseman. And I've really found that over the last couple of years that there's a lot of people out there that really let the goalie situation slip away from them, and they're drafting them too late. So, I know there obviously are a couple of goalies out there like Shesterkin, Vasilevsky. I've even seen Sorokin get drafted in the 2nd round this year so far. Guys who are going to get taken in the 1st and 2nd round. But my strategy has always been to draft my first goalie in the 3rd or 4th round. So my question to you is, what round is ideal for you to select your 1st and 2nd goalie in the draft?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it depends on your specific league settings and maybe the ratio of like goalie categories to skater categories as well. But it's funny that like I kind of run a goalie site. I'm probably a lot more patient than you even. I really wait to take my goalies, and I just think it's because you can find so much value later in drafts and even on the waiver wire. I think if you look, I always tell people when they ask this question, like go back to your last year's draft and look at the goalies drafted in the 2nd round and then compare them to the goalies drafted in like the 10th round, let's say, and then do the same thing for like a center, for example. Yeah. I think you're going to find the value between a goalie taken in like the 2nd round, like last year, for example, like I think Robin Lehner probably went in the 2nd or 3rd round in a lot of leagues, right? And then you look at which goalies were really strong last year. You could have got late, like Jonathan Quick probably had more value than Robin Lehner last year, right?
Thank you.
Whereas if you look at a center, maybe you're taking like Crosby in the 2nd round, and then you could look at the 12th round or something. That disparity is going to be a lot bigger, right? So for myself, I tend to wait till the later rounds, but that's also because sort of my league allows it. We have, I think, 6 or 7 skater categories versus only 4 goalie. But yeah, there is, like you mentioned, there's a danger of definitely waiting too long because, as we all know, sometimes you get those goalie runs where 6 people take a goalie in a row and you're just sort of sweating it out because you're not picking for another 10 picks and you don't have a starter yet. But there's always value you can find on the waiver wire, right? Like there's goalies like Ilya Samsonov last year. I don't think he was drafted probably in many leagues. He ended up being one of the best options. So yeah, if you can risk waiting, I think it's good. But there's always a point where, if a Shesterkin and if a Vasilevsky does fall a little bit, like those guys are pretty much anchors for your team. So yeah, they can help you out a lot.
Yeah, that's just it. It's the anchoring the team, because when you don't have to worry about, especially in a league that has, limited either free agent auction dollars or limited additions throughout the season, sometimes you can burn through a lot swapping goalies in and out. And when you don't have to worry about that and you can literally just leave a couple of guys in there, that leaves you to focus on the rest of your team also and not have to worry about those, free agent dollars or minutes played or any of those things to rack up. But listen, Michael, this is one of those conversations that I think this year more than ever, and that's what I alluded to off the top of the show. When I look at these top 25 lists, when I look at your top 100 keeper lists on goaliepost.com, by the way, listeners out there, please follow and check out Goalie Post and Michael Amato on Twitter. Very great follows, especially for daily updates during the season. He's got you covered for starting netminders every night and fantasy projections. So there is a shout out there. But what I need to know, Amato, is this year it looks juicy. It looks like there's more options than ever. So maybe what you're talking about in waiting till the later rounds really is the move this season. And I don't know what you think about this, because I want to hear some of the goalies that are maybe under the radar this season that people could really capitalize on if the situation, we know anything can happen, injuries and otherwise. But are there some under the radar guys that you might be looking at this season as good fantasy options, perhaps even in Vegas?
Yeah, definitely. So every summer I do a column and it's basically entitled "Who will be this year's, insert name here." So 2 years ago it was Alex Nedeljkovic. This summer it was Ville Husso. You're always trying to find that goalie that basically no one is thinking about at this time and during your drafts that, hey, might be there. And if you don't even draft him, maybe it's a quick trigger figure on the waiver wire when something happens. There's a couple of great options. Like you mentioned Vegas. I think Logan Thompson would have been definitely fall into that category. And he still does to an extent. I think Leonard's injury obviously helps his value, but I think now it's also going to make him a little bit less under the radar. Like people are going to know about that and they're going to, want to draft him. I think the Golden Knights GM just announced today they are going to roll with Thompson and Brossoit as a tandem. So I think a lot of people are going to be targeting Thompson in their drafts. But yeah, he's definitely one. He fits the category, right? An opportunity.
Yep, exactly.
He's got a strong team behind him, and he played well in a small sample size last year. So he's one for sure. But I think there's also a few others. You can sort of look maybe a little bit off the board, like Pyotr Kochetkov from Carolina. He's third on the depth chart, but look at the two goalies there, Anderson and Ranta. Like, what are the chances both of those guys are going to stay healthy for the entire season, right? Like, he's probably going to he's probably going to get a chance to come up to the team, for a month or so, and who knows, maybe he gets on a run like Nedeljkovic did with the Canes, and he's that guy. I think to a lesser extent, there's, Daniel Tarasov in Columbus. He's also third on the depth chart. Oof. Korpisalo is in front of him. He might be able to pass him, and maybe Columbus is a lot better this year because of the offseason additions they made. I think Merzlikins is still a really good goalie there, but just kind of thinking outside the box sometimes. And even we mentioned him briefly earlier, Stuart Skinner, right? Like, how many games is Jack Campbell going to play, right? Like maybe 45 to 50. So there's 30 to 35 from Skinner on a good team. He might get you 20 wins and hopefully like a 9-10 save percentage at least. That's pretty good, right? Like, so I think when you sort of look for those goalies and you're maybe waiting to draft goalies, you sort of have to think outside the box and kind of what things might happen. And hopefully your league has maybe some good roster limits where you can stash them and maybe they can pay off for you later.
Got to do that research, got to do the deep dives. And honestly, hearing what you're saying, at some point down the line when it comes to goalies in fantasy, regardless of the format, and you made some good points about how do the statistics line up, what are the formats, those are obviously key. But you have to get lucky at some point. You have to get lucky. And, you're mentioning guys third on the depth chart. Sometimes you're going to have to get lucky and run a flyer and just add them off the waiver wire and stash them. So I love everything that you're saying. Only a couple questions left for Mr. Michael Amato. Steele, do you have one more? I think I have one more in the barrel for after if you have one.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask him about what he thinks of the Vegas Golden Knights, not just the goalie tandem in net and Brossoit and Thompson, but the team overall. Because Flip and I have gone back and forth about the Vegas Golden Knights. I don't think they have it in them this year to make it to the playoffs. You know, I think we can see a bounce back season from guys like Alex Pietrangelo. I think Jack Eichel is going to be a great addition to any fantasy team, but with Thompson and Brossoit and net, I'm not sold on those two guys.
Yeah, it's definitely unpredictable for sure. Like, I think there's just a lot of potential there when you're drafting, when you look at those type of goalies. But yeah, I think with the team overall, they had so many injuries last year. It was really hard to evaluate that season. You could be right, and they could be sort of heading for a bit of a different turn. But, you know, like Stone missed a ton of time last year. Eichel, obviously, some key defensemen like Alec Martinez was out quite a bit for them last year. So I don't know. I'm sort of holding back judgment until I see them a little bit more. And I think another thing to keep in mind, they're in a pretty weak division, right? Like, I would argue that that's probably the weakest division in the league. So there's a lot of, you know, you got Anaheim, San Jose is not too strong, right? I think there's some weaker teams in that division.
For sure.
So I could see them bouncing back. Do I think they're going to be like a 110-point team and back at the top of the league again? Probably not. But I don't know. I think they could be strong and potentially contend for a playoff spot.
I agree. And I think just the Mark Stone, Jack Eichel with a full off season and a regular off season upcoming, I think that team is going to be improved. I don't know if they're good enough to hang now that what Calgary has done, another year of the core of Edmonton together. I know defensively Edmonton leaves a lot to be desired, but I think that offense is just going to be so spicy this year, and a little bit of an improvement in the net with Jack Campbell. I do think the Battle of Alberta might be the toast of rivalries next season. I asked you about guys that are under the radar. I want to ask you as my last question, and thank you so much for your time today, my friend. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can get you back on the show more often than not, because I appreciate your insight. But how about goalies that you might want to avoid? How about some overrated goalies going into the season this year? Because there might be some situations, and again, I mentioned the splits, that might work against some guys. So I don't know if there's some goalies you're looking at that might be overrated headed into this season.
Yeah, I think there's a couple. Like, one team I find interesting is the Bruins, with the coaching change and all the injuries they have. You know, I know when Cassidy was there, I know everyone talked about how like Barry Trotz was such a great goalie friendly coach, but I think Cassidy was really the best of the bunch, right? And maybe that's something I should have mentioned about Vegas too, that now that he's there. But I know when he was there in 5 years with Boston, I think the Bruins finished like first, fourth, and fifth in goals against in the 5 years he was there. So
great defensive coach.
Yeah. And that really benefited, you know, somebody like Swayman, who's young, not that experienced. And now I think going into this year, you know, you don't have Charlie McAvoy for a bit to start the season. I think they have a couple other defenders that are going to miss some time.
Bruins are in tough this year.
Brad Marchand, obviously. So I really haven't seen, you know, Swayman and Allmark drop significantly on a lot of rankings. And, you know, maybe I think a lot of people doubt the Bruins every year. I think they're getting old and they just keep rolling. So maybe it's a mistake, but I don't know. I just think I'd be a little more cautious about using a high pick on maybe Swayman or Allmark as far as goaltending goes.
Love it.
So that's a good example, I think, of a team that, you know, might take a step back and if they don't, maybe they're just a little weaker defensively.
Hey man, you are absolutely just preaching what I want to hear right now. I have the Bruins missing out on the playoffs. I still think they're a good team. This is really the last kick at the can for this core. People are loving David Krejci coming back, and I do see the fantasy value, but the guy played overseas last year, and he's 36 going on 37. I don't exactly see this being I see it great for Bruins fans. But anyway, this isn't the Hate on the Bruins podcast. It was a focus on fantasy options for goaltenders with the expert Michael Amato from goaliepost.com. My friend, thank you so much for joining us today. I know I enjoyed the conversation. I can tell Steele did as well. I hope our listeners did as well. Make sure you check out goaliepost.com on Twitter. Check out Michael Amato on Twitter. And I hope that you will be back soon, my friend, to talk some more hockey and, of course, goaltending.
Anytime, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Don't forget, we are free and available on all podcast platforms, which also includes YouTube. So make sure you hit the subscribe, hit the follow button. And thank you so much for all the love and support out there. And real quick, before we do get back into the conversation, need to let you guys know that you need to be safe out there while you're on the roads. Make sure you're not drinking and driving. And I'm going to go through a little scenario here. Just make sure that everyone is thinking and being safe out there. You're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks, and a few becomes way too many. As the evening comes to an end, people start to head out. They start to get in their cars, call cabs. And what do you think? You live nearby. You think you can drive, and you think you can make it home. It's no big deal. But that's not the case. What are the odds that you get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's worse? What's the worst thing that could happen? Your insurance goes up, you lose your license, you lose your job, you total your car, or you kill someone. Everyone knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on the roads to save all of our lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, please think again. Play it safe, plan ahead, and get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. Flip, let's get right back into the conversation, though. Let's tie this episode off with a nice, beautiful bow here. What a great conversation, though, with Michael Amato of Goalie Post, getting the information, the insight that everyone needs heading into the draft season for your fantasy league on which goalies to look out for, which goalies to avoid, and what rounds you should be drafting your goalies in, because he thinks his strategy is to, wait a little bit, let them slide a little bit longer. Mine is, like I said, mine has always been to draft my first goalie in the 3rd or 4th round, but the guru expert for goalies, he's suggesting to let them slide just a little bit more to the 5th, 6th, maybe even the 7th round, but make sure you're not waiting too long.
This is why you listen to the experts, Steele, and you and I have a lot of hockey under our belts, a lot of fantasy knowledge under the cap. But when you bring on guys like Michael Amato, who literally studies goaltenders as his job, you have to sometimes just take a step back and listen to what the man is saying. And if he's telling you that this year especially, which I think both you and I had mentioned before, that this season upcoming is one of those years that you really can get a couple of goalies that may have not played this many games in previous seasons, but because it's a 50-50 split, you have a lot more options out there. And I want to ask you, if you do look at, Amato's most recently posted article on Goalie Post, he breaks down the tiers of goalies, and I think it's quite clear the top tier, Andrei Vasilevsky, Igor Shesterkin, right on their heels in the second tier, UC Saros, Sorokin, Tristan Jarry, even guys like Markstrom, Bobrovsky, Demko. What I want to talk to you about is the tier 2 down from there, not the Jack Campbells, the Swaymans, the Ottingers, the one below, the tier 3, the guys that are kind of fading vets, some prospects, guys who are about to make the jump. That's where I want to ask you about the kind of 18 to 29 range of the top 30 goaltenders, because I look at a couple of names on this list that I'm intrigued by. Cal Peterson, Cam Talbot, Carter Hart, not so much. Spencer Knight. Are there any of those guys that you would be willing to, like you said, wait a little while, because these guys will probably be around, and pounce on later? Because if you can get it right, Jordan Binnington might be a guy who's in line for a bounce back year. I don't know, Steele, but what are those guys that you're looking at? Would you take a risk with Spencer Knight or one of those guys in this 3rd tier, if you will?
Well, it's actually kind of funny that Bobrovsky's in tier 2 of this list, because I actually drafted him in round 10 of my fantasy draft. So he slipped a ton down the fantasy draft board. And you can expect that from a lot of fantasy leagues this season. Bobrovsky is going to be one of those goalies that keeps on sliding, because like we talked about before, with his age going up this season, the Florida Panthers trying to, push him out of the crease and get Spencer Knight in there. That's a lot of signs for teams or owners that don't want to draft him for their fantasy team. But that's a guy that I would, allow him to slide down a little bit more and draft him at the proper time, which I did at round 10. But you were right. Guys like Cam Talbot, Jonathan Quick, Cal Peterson, those were guys I were looking at in the later rounds as well. Guys that were sliding down the list. It's actually funny enough, I was just about to draft Cam Talbot, and then he got traded to the Ottawa Senators, and someone drafted him right before me. So you never know what might happen. But those are the type of guys in that tier that you could see getting drafted, letting slide down a little bit, sliding down the draft list and drafting them a little bit later in the fantasy draft.
You're going to have to also get lucky. We've said that before. We'll say that again. And I'll say this again. This is your source, your hub, and your location for all of your fantasy draft needs. I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record, so my bad out there if I do. But trust me, there are a lot more awesome guests upcoming who pay their bills with their fantasy winnings. Steele and I are trying to get there too, so that's why you're along for this ride. And thank you for being along for today's episode, because I think that if you were paying attention even a little bit, you're in better shape than you were for next season than you were before you started this episode. I know I am. So thank you so much for being here, because next week, Steele, we are almost back to 5 a week, baby. It's a full court press till October 12th, 13th.
Yeah, we've got some time, but we're going to get right back into the swing of things. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. But for your second listen, you have to go check out Locked On NHL. Locked On experts give you a daily 30-minute podcast on all things NHL all year long. Stay up to date on everything in the hockey world. Locked On NHL, your daily 30-minute NHL podcast, which is free and available on all podcast platforms, just like this podcast right here. So hit the subscribe, hit the follow button. Once you do, you'll get all the latest episodes of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast. And like Flip said, we're getting back to 5 episodes per week, 21 episodes per month in September. So you don't want to miss out on all the content coming up, all the episodes Flip and I have brewing. Thank you so much again for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I. Have a great day. Good luck with all your bets out there. And we shall see you back here again tomorrow.
Peace.